What was the thinking then to launch something like IB Chat?
And just the idea that you can search for any of your communication internally became a product within itself that turned into an enterprise messenger.
Do you see kind of chat data as a strategic asset?
100%, yeah. I don't think there's enough being done at this point with that level of data flow.
LSEG, which is an exchange, owns Messenger. ICE, the exchange, has got ICE Chat. CME Pivot, that's been around for a long time. What's the link between exchanges and chat?
Very interesting. Free chat doesn't really resonate with people unless there's really like deep, high-value workflows.
So chatbots have been around for a very long time. Why they're so important?
You know, the way we view bots in financial markets are going to change drastically over the next 2 to 3 years.
This is Matthew Chung. I'm CEO of ipushpull, and this is the Capital Markets FinTech Forum. And today we're joined by Damian Sasso, who's a group product manager at PolyAI and has cut his teeth in the world of chat for a very long time. Welcome, Damian.
Thanks, Matt. Nice to be here.
Let's jump into your career history, because you've worked in a lot of the major chat platforms. It'd be interesting to hear about kind of where you started with that and how that's evolved over the years.
Yeah, I mean, I've probably spent a bulk of my career working in the chat space in fintech. Originally spent about 12 years, the beginning part of my career at Bloomberg, with the last part of that working on a platform that had a lot of integration with Bloomberg's, or at least a lot of potential with Bloomberg's chat platform, which was known as the Bloomberg App Portal, and then spent about a year and a half, which felt a lot longer than that, at Symphony, which is obviously a huge player in the chat space in fintech, and then about 5 years after that, working at what was Refinitiv and then became London Stock Exchange, working on Icon Messenger, and then we renamed it Refinitiv Messenger and subsequently LSEG Messenger, and then some of the things that they've recently announced around Microsoft Teams and London Stock Exchange. So yeah, cut the better part of my career working in fintech chat, and love the space, love the potential behind it. And it's great to talk about.
Let's start with Bloomberg Chat. That's the most dominant chat platform in the financial markets, with 350,000 kind of users on the chat. If you're coming from a 2025 kind of software background, the interface that you might see for some of the Bloomberg terminal in the chat feels quite old and old school, rather, in terms of its view. Can you talk about, I suppose, some of the decisions that were made there, and actually now they really love that interface, and it's probably quite difficult to move them into different UIs and UXs because it's become so efficient. So can you talk about, from a product perspective, the efficiency of the interface, as well as probably maybe we can talk about it as a thread as we go on, the way people talk in chat has meant that people communicate in the lowest number of keystrokes? Yeah,
I mean, Bloomberg Chat's an interesting thing. I mean, it certainly evolved in the way that the Bloomberg UX was behind it from when it launched in the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, most people probably don't remember that you used to be able to log into your AOL Instant Messenger account, as it's known, IB Chat, IB. And that really, I think, kind of dictated in many ways the way that Bloomberg simplified the UI behind Bloomberg Chat for such a long period of time. And then as years went on, it started to feel like a platform that was almost archaic as these enterprise messaging tools came out, like Teams and Slack, and obviously Symphony did so many cool things with their UI. But I think one of the things that traders have always appreciated, users of Bloomberg Chat in other asset classes, and then obviously their internal teams always appreciated, was the simplicity behind it. And the fact that surfacing critical information, and it was always the key aspect of what Bloomberg was trying to do with IB. And that's really unique because we really haven't seen, I think, a lot of enterprise messengers across other industries try to really take that spin of they try to become like workflow tools, they try to become knowledge bases. But Bloomberg was always about surfacing information that was critical and making sure that you didn't get as much noise there. I mean, Bloomberg even had a feature in IB where, and other enterprise messengers have adopted this just as an example, where things that were non-critical to you in IB would eventually disappear if you didn't use them. They just basically, because every messaging, every chat, every DM that you had there would ultimately be somewhat persistent in a way, but Bloomberg IB always did a good job of keeping your experience there clean. And that's something that I think only recently, as time's gone on, users really appreciate. And Bloomberg's modernized IB, but it still has that feel that it had like 20 some odd years ago. And I think as we start to see things modernize, it's going to be even more pertinent, that really simplified view of communicating with other people.
So you mentioned like AOL. So I remember probably when I started off my career in the city on Bloomberg, you had obviously MSG and you could send messages to people. What was the tipping point then from moving from, well, not tipping point, but what was when did IB chat come online, and what was the thinking behind that at the time? Because obviously things like in the FX market, you've had in some of the FX trading platforms, you've had quite basic messaging in there, but it was very limited into just asking about prices. You couldn't really have a conversation because the UX didn't really allow it. What was the thinking then to launch something like IB chat?
I mean, the thing that IB that maybe people don't appreciate is it was effectively an evolution of Bloomberg MSG. I mean, MSG came probably like the late 80s into the early 90s, as Bloomberg was really like a desktop terminal-based product that needed communication for exchanging pricing. And this predates a lot of the regulation that exists in place today for chat in fintech, where you need proper compliance capture, proper e-discovery. You just needed basically a record of what was being sent. And the immediacy of a couple things on the Bloomberg side. One was obviously, immediacy of communication when you start to transition into an instant messaging tool. So you had these tools like ICQ, AOL Instant Messenger, you remember Yahoo Messenger, MSN. They were starting to become prevalent in financial markets in the 90s into 2000s. And it was a response to that. And it certainly was a response to something that maybe people don't appreciate, which is Bloomberg's support functions through the same platform that people communicate with in IB. And so if you're sitting there in the plumbing of the decision to bring Bloomberg IB chat into play in the late 90s into the early 2000s, MSG is actually underlaying a lot of those chats, like the actual technology. You're spinning up a Bloomberg MSG effectively thread when you initially spun up an IB chat. And so it was an evolution of that for sure, and an evolution of creating more immediacy, which obviously is key in fintech.
That's interesting about the support side, and some of the technology used in support actually becomes a product later on, because that's very much like Slack, right? Because Slack, when they started, were a gaming company. They were running out of money, and then they decided to pivot into the chat platform that they built internally, which then they've sold for tens of billions to Salesforce since then.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't Slack is an acronym ultimately for something about like searchable, searchable knowledge base. I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's basically was built as an internal tool for being able to search everything within that gaming company, and then just the idea that you can search for any of your communication internally became a product within itself that turned into an enterprise messenger. And obviously, Bloomberg, all the other enterprise messengers kind of, in some ways, did what Bloomberg did with IB, because searchability around Bloomberg IB was something that was, and searchability around Bloomberg MSG was there from almost origination of the product. And we're talking about mid 2000s, early 2000s. Slack would come, many years later, decades later, and has the same concepts and the same principles and applies to a completely different space. It's very interesting because a lot of these things obviously weren't built inspired by one or another, but the way people communicate and the way people search for records of communication is so critically important. So the themes tend to resonate. So
what we've seen obviously in the marketplace is different asset classes gravitate towards different types of chat platforms. And looking at, because obviously you spent time at Symphony and LSEG Messenger, or kind of Reuters Messenger when it started. Was it the case that I think David Gurley spent some time at Reuters Messenger a long time back, and that was one of the kind of catalysts of him getting into chat and going into Perzo and Symphony?
Yeah, I mean, David's the David's the godfather of Reuters Messenger. I mean, people don't realize that, but it really started with some of the work that he did at Microsoft with Skype. I mean, a lot of the initial back end behind Reuters Messenger was built using Microsoft technology. And there were a lot of things in the original Reuters Messenger around bots and workflows that you probably still haven't seen in another platform yet today in the same way that it did. It was pretty revolutionary product, and definitely give David his credit for what was done there. Because the truth is, Reuters had platforms like dealing back into the 1980s that were in the FX space, had certainly robust communities and other asset classes that they could build off of. And then you had, like we talked about, other platforms coming online, whether it was Bloomberg IB or other asset classes using, like FX, good example, commodities, good example, using things like, MSN, Yahoo Messenger, AOL, all at the same time. And I think one of the things that probably doesn't get appreciated is, I think, that original team had a lot of view on workflow. And this is even in the mid 2000s of bringing in things like chatbots, bringing in things like workflow for asset classes. And a lot of that stuff has disappeared because it was, 2 to 3 iterations of the product to go. But you saw that ultimately carry over into the principles that were used when David did the work he did with Symphony.
So moving on to Symphony then, would obviously their USPs, originally a lot of it was around the end-to-end encryption and you own your keys, so only you can see your data. But then later on, a lot of focus was on the chat being an infrastructure layer where there's a very rich open APIs and bots and so on that you can build in that world, which now other platforms are releasing their own versions of that. Can you kind of talk through that evolution from different products focuses over the years?
Yeah, and I think that's when I think about like the history, and I think probably my background, I may have been able to see this hopefully as good as anyone else can, but you can see workflow back to the original Reuters dealing that was in the FX space. It was almost like a platform that was driving FX trading that, was a terminal product back in the 80s that had the same principles that you would eventually see driving bots in things like Reuters Messenger and obviously Symphony. And I think Symphony ended up really taking a unique look at workflow with bots that had a couple principles that were key. One was certainly the identity around bots and bots within Symphony, where you could make them part of a group chat, whether it was a group chat internally within, your financial services institution, whether it was something that was cross firm. And that was probably the first iteration of that, like in a large scale, collaboration tool. Slack, Microsoft Teams ended up making those workflows, and this is obviously more in the enterprise space, making them more internally focused, making them less identity focused. And so in Symphony, you really had a robust SDK for building chatbots with structured objects, with identity across firm, if you wanted to use those chatbots in those situations. And then you also had the ability in many ways that you had chatbots talking to chatbots in Symphony, which was super interesting. And I think that was certainly one of the things that Symphony did, that when you stack up just Symphony, ignore financial services where it's been so prevalent, but if you stack that up as a product against anything else in chat and collaboration, very unique and still unique in many ways to how they approach that workflow around chatbots. But that flavor ends up different for every asset class for sure, and ends up different for every institution type. But it's something that, is really unique when you start to stitch the history of collaboration together and how Symphony played such a key role in that.
So moving to Messenger, so there's Reuters Messenger, then there's Refinitiv Messenger, now it's LSEG Messenger. There was some replatforming that took place in the last couple of years. Can you kind of talk through what Messenger looks like now versus probably what it was when it started off? Yeah,
I think there's probably a lot of work that's still going on the London Stock Exchange side to kind of bring the work that had been done around LSEG Messenger to as many people as possible. But one of the really unique things that they've launched in the past couple years is something called advanced dealing, which is an iteration of the platform I mentioned before, which brings together this idea of chatting with your contacts and also executing on trading workflows in FX that use natural language. And that was one of the really key principles that our teams there were trying to develop out, was really bring some of that natural language capability into execution, and then still having it remain a compliant, regulated experience, which is key now. I mean, we were talking about things like AIM and Yahoo Messenger. I mean, that was a different time at the turn of the century when it came to regulation and messaging technology. It was effectively like the wild, wild west. And now, come into 2025, you have such heightened regulation. You see fines around things like WhatsApp usage in financial services. And one of the key tenets that I think London Stock Exchange has tried to do, and we tried to do when we were there, was really maintain that regulated and compliant experience for things that were intended to be trading. And I think in many ways, it's a very unique offering that they have there, specifically in FX. It was definitely aimed at what their competitors have done in that same space over time. So very, very cool stuff. Where the product is and how it continues to evolve since I've left. I anticipate they'll continue to add value using technologies and AI.
Where do you see people paying for chat versus having it free sits? Because if you take something like Bloomberg, chat is one of the main reasons people use Bloomberg, but it's one of 1,000 things that you can use on the terminal, through to Messenger, which is free to use, or something like Ice Chat that might be free to use, but then if you want to use the APIs for it, you might have to pay for. And then Symphony obviously is a standalone chat that you're paying for. So one of the things that I suppose has happened in the environment as well, like we're in financial markets, but LSEG, which is an exchange, owns Messenger. You obviously got ICE, the exchange has got ICE Chat. CME has now partnered with Symphony to use that as its kind of preferred chat, and shelving Pivot, CME Pivot, that's been around for a long time. What's the link between exchanges and chat?
I mean, exchanges and chat is very interesting because I don't know that you've seen. I mean, let's take a look at the CME Pivot use case, right? And this is just looking at it at 30,000 foot view of how successful that was over time. It really depended upon workflows that were around, like high value workflows. And I think that really is where you look at like something like what ICE has done with ICE Chat, and we can get into Bloomberg in a second, is you need to have high value where you're solving workflow pain points that are directly connected to making money in markets. And I think Bloomberg obviously not an exchange, data provider, data infrastructure provider, but they've always had a very good view of integrating chat with every aspect of the Bloomberg terminal. So when we say things like people just use Bloomberg for chat, it's I always view it as a very simplified view of something that's much more complicated than that, because chat ties into all of their execution platforms, ties into, like we said, customer service there, ties into how people communicate internally. And then you see platforms like, ICE Chat, things like what CME tried to do with Pivot, probably less prevalent when you look at integrating with every aspect of their product offerings. And that's probably dictated the success there, like how successful, obviously CME shut down Pivot and now gone to embrace Symphony. Symphony is a platform that permeates the culture of that company and then permeates other aspects of financial markets than just communication, starts to get into workflow. And I think that's really where you start to talk about like free chat doesn't really resonate with people unless there's really like deep, high value workflows, because that becomes price agnostic over time. And that's what Bloomberg has had the ability to benefit from. And, other data providers, other exchanges, varying degrees of success there.
And I guess on the back of that, some of the add-on or things that can be chargeable by the chat providers. You mentioned like NLP earlier. So on the advanced dealing, you'll be using some form of NLP to extract out prices and orders. Bloomberg and ICE have their own kind of enriched feeds that then can do some of this as well. Can you talk through why actually that's again a crucial part of chat when it comes to trading, extracting out that information that matters?
Yeah, I mean, Bloomberg has had product offerings tied to message scraping for a long time, since nearly the beginning of IB. I think several years later, Message and IB, the same thing, offering like a pricing scraping product. And then when you have something like what Reuters segues into LSEG had with dealing and subsequently advanced dealing, those are high value execution platforms in FX trading that once again become things that are very price agnostic, and they've had a strong moat there. And then something like Symphony as a platform has had sort of a moat around bringing those internal and external workflows for financial services into collaboration. So I mean, add-ons or price agnostic products, things where there's almost inelastic demand that use chat, because chat is so ingrained in the way we communicate as human beings, and it spills into every aspect of our lives, not just consumer chat, customer service, but then when you get into financial markets, how people communicate. And it's really evolved to where those platforms that can be price agnostic, add-on services or core services, have a leg up for sure on the market and on continued growth and like what we refer to as stickiness.
So you mentioned consumers, and if you take something like WhatsApp, it's probably the biggest consumer chat application out there with 3 billion users, I think now.
Yeah, wow.
There's two pieces related to that. One around identity and one around group chat. And specifically, let's talk about WhatsApp and maybe some of the other things like Teams as well, because group chats and identity becomes it sounds very trivial, but it's not. It's very complicated. And I think a lot of chat platforms, if they've not built in a particular way, actually struggle with providing those two things: an identity linked to a person versus a user or a bot, or versus a phone number. Group chats and the types of workflows that you might want to be able to do in financial markets can be quite different to the consumer world.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things are going on with group chat. I think we've seen the issue that popped up with the U.S. government using Signal, and that becoming like a situation where someone that didn't belong in what was, an internal government chat somehow ended up there. And you've seen some recent steps from product releases by WhatsApp to start to acknowledge the fact that they need to have some almost security around group chats, around communities. These are obviously concepts that have been part of financial market communication tools for ages, because you've had restrictions in place where only two firms can talk in group chats, or you've had restrictions in place where only verified identities can, converse in things like group chats. You've now seen it become a problem with consumer platforms where, when we look at WhatsApp is at that almost inflection point where we don't know what it's going to become. Like, it could become, Meta would probably love for it to become something that's used across all aspects of our lives, from, enterprise communication to consumer communication. But when you do that, there's obviously challenges you're going to run into that, aren't necessarily the way the platform was viewed from the beginning. But when you look at financial services messengers, Symphony, Icon into LSEG Messenger, Bloomberg, these are all platforms that we're having to solve from the beginning. And they've done it from varying degrees of success, but verified identity and communication restrictions are like key baseline features for those platforms. And now you see things like WhatsApp starting to think about it the same way, as it spills into not necessarily financial services, though we could talk about that use, but certainly starts to tease with the idea of being an enterprise communication tool.
Yeah, well, WhatsApp's actually the odd one out because it's the only one that really spans business life and personal life. Whereas all the rest, like Bloomberg Chat, really, you're just using it for business. You might talk about personal things in the day, but it's Monday to Friday. Whereas WhatsApp, it's something you're always using to communicate. So in terms of, you mentioned like Signal and some of the fallout that's happened with unencrypted chats, with actually due to probably like the US government and people that use those type of services to record their chats for archiving and surveillance. Ironically, the archiving and surveillance has been the little Achilles heel for people to crack into these unencrypted chats. But going into the world of, I suppose, open and closed chats, there's solutions that some providers are making available to provide this kind of interoperability or federated chat where you can talk between different chat platforms. Now, some platforms are quite happy for their chat platforms to be used in that way, and some others are not. The idea of having this kind of federated chat probably goes back again to that identity management piece. How do you see, I suppose, this message relay, of being able to share messages between chat platforms? Do you think that could evolve in this enterprise environment where some exchanges and big vendors own chats versus having something very open? Because there's been some initiatives like an open directory that has tried to get people to look at these things more openly rather than having a closed walled garden. What's your view on that?
I mean, I think it's a complicated topic because people in financial services would ultimately love the ability for open communication. I think you've seen data and infrastructure providers dating back 10, 15 years looking at initiatives around that. Symphony was one. There was, market federated chat at one point that was attempting to tackle that same concept. And I think some of it is around creating a level playing field for things like data and workflow, as opposed to having this concept of like chat and community access being almost a pay to play, variable. But it's easier said than done because ultimately, you have to have incentive for a platform to open up its communication to be easily federated between other platforms. And we just haven't seen that happen in financial services. And we certainly haven't seen it even happen in consumer areas. And I think some of those principles are important to keep in mind. It took such a long time for just RCS to be part of iMessage, where if you're communicating between, let's say, text message on GChat on Google to iMessage, you're not getting a green bubble, you're getting a blue bubble, right? And that in many ways is not federation. It's just an experience. Us as consumers now feel like we're part of a single community of people when we're on iMessage or when we're on like a text messaging based platform. I think financial services would love to get to that point. But once again, we get down to the nuts and bolts of why people communicate in financial services, really like workflow and high value workflow. And if you can't tackle that and make that seem seamless across platform, that's why I tend to see these initiatives reach an inflection point, somewhat stall out. It'll be interesting to see what happens, with some of the players in the space looking at it now, like, will that grab hold? I think it has to be truly something that's open, cross-platform, and it has to bring things that we've started to see important in financial services messengers like bots and integrated workflows be truly the same experience cross-platform. And that, I think, if that can happen, then there's potential. And then the last piece is really the identity. If you're going to have an identity of a trusted either workflow, let's say a trusted chatbot or agent, a trusted person, that identity provider almost needs to be itself an open, almost agreed upon platform. It can't necessarily be, just a largely used technology solution that would be used, meaning like an adopted technology solution, let's say like Google had identity or Microsoft has identity or any of those. I think it needs to be something that there be an agreed upon almost, consortium of technology providers, customers that agreed upon how they're going to verify people.
And so I suppose the big gorilla in the room is probably Microsoft with Teams, because before COVID, I think there was like 30 million users. Now there's like 350 million and rising. So the kind of the addressable market in financial markets, you've probably got on any given day, there's 500,000 people or so that are interacting in chat in a trading kind of workflow. But then with 350 million users in teams worldwide, maybe 10 million of those are in financial services. Microsoft Teams and probably a few years ago with something like Slack, you've always been able to connect two different tenants of Slack, to another tenant in Slack, or same with Teams. But the UI UX was never really designed from that for day one to having this kind of inter-firm kind of chat. How do you see kind of that evolving with the likes of Microsoft and these much bigger players?
It's actually evolved a lot slower than I expected it was going to be honest, because you saw Slack go into Slack Connect quite early. I think it was almost predated COVID, like 2019 timeframe. And I think you just touched on a little bit about some of the challenges there. I mean, they have a huge, good enough size community where that really could have taken hold, but kind of the user experience behind it might not have been ideal to make it a frictionless experience. I think the same thing, right now with Microsoft spinning down the Skype brand. I mean, many people for years saw Skype as the potential to start linking up firms in all different industries because it was widely used by everyone. It was a low screen real estate platform, so it's very naturally integrated into your daily life. It just never materialized. And I think with Microsoft Teams and the install base, the potential is once again there for really like robust cross-platform communication. But the big challenge is going to be user experience. It's going to be frictionless experience. Like, is it going to feel like something that's been sort of tacked on to an existing platform that was really engineered for internal communication and now as an external component? I think we'll have to see how that plays out. One thing we know is, certainly Symphony and financial services really thought about that from the beginning in many ways. And itself has, as always, that's always a challenge to start getting a platform that, let's say, IT teams, market data teams at financial services firms have sort of earmarked for internal communication only, start to allow them to use it for external communication. And that, I think, is going to be a non-trivial thing to solve for.
Let's move on to bots and agents as well. So chatbots have been around for a very long time across many different types of chat platforms. But in the financial markets, we've probably seen them initially being used in I suppose in the masses with Symphony, because of the kind of the open APIs and the richness of the UIs, UX, and the type of workflows that you can do and what you're permissioned to do. And then over time, we've seen other platforms start to release similar type of bot SDKs and what have you. Now, bots have been around for, like I said, a very long time. And in Symphony, in the 7-8 years since those APIs have been available, have been used there with, I think, over a quarter of messages on Symphony are bot-to-bot messages. In the world we're in at the moment, where ChatGPT has come around in the last 2 years, the idea of what a chatbot is has probably changed in perception, because the chatbots you would have built 10 years ago are very much command line interface bots, where it's kind of like a simple syntax or query where you're fetching some information or you're triggering an event. With the advent of obviously ChatGPT and Gen AI, people then think about this kind of large language model powered bot that can do a lot of different things, which still is in its infancy, probably in financial markets, in prototype kind of phase. It's not really used that heavily in the world of trading. Like, we see lots of use cases where large language models we know are great for summarizing information, for taking a large amount of information and retrieving that and giving some summary of it, i.e. for scanning research reports or scanning your Confluence page. We've seen lots of use cases for that type of chatbot. We've seen use cases of Copilot used in Microsoft Office Suite or the GitHub Copilot. has seen some huge use, and there's some big productivity there. But still, going back to what we're talking about, in the Capital Markets FinTech Forum, is about trading workflows, and a lot of that being in chat. So can we talk about the advent of bots in probably the Symphony world, and then how that's kind of spilled out in other places, and why they're so important and heavily used for a lot of automation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, with bots and integrated workflows into chat, you start to get into some of the other things we've talked about around, like, the prevalence of Bloomberg IB, and Bloomberg is like an integrated solution. Chatbots really became prevalent in other platforms because workflow could be brought out of, like, this terminal component. It could be brought into more of a platform that's focused on external communication and workflow. As long as you have the data and the permissions and the ability to provide that solution, it's a great thing to offer. And so Symphony really provided that platform where firms could build their own workflows using their own market data permissions, and then eventually spilled into, cross firm bot talks to bot workflow solutions really start to live in this ecosystem that was Symphony. Now we have LLM and agents becoming more prevalent, and what we've seen is probably more this information agent like use case becoming initially prevalent in financial services. But that is something that isn't as important as these more high value execution, price discovery workflows that we haven't really seen become super prevalent yet. So I think what we're going to have to see over time is some of the things you touched on as well, like what is going to be the ability for us to, as a fintech industry, be able to validate the identity of an agent, the identity of people using an agent living in these types of, like, cross-firm, high-value conversations. That's really going to be, I think, how we see we see chatbots evolve over time. And certainly, I think one of the other things that's really important here to consider is, can firms really lean into that as unique solutions? I'm talking about the market, the infrastructure, financial infrastructure firms lean into that as a unique solution that's worth a lot of high value. And I believe they can. I believe we've seen this in something like advanced dealing from LSEG that we've talked about. I think we've also seen startup players like a FinChat provide capability for just getting information at a cost that's much more palatable than, say, the cost that a financial desktop terminal used to be. So that's really the market forces at play with the whole concept of an agent and a bot. But it's an exciting space at this point, and I'm expecting that the way we view bots in financial markets are going to change drastically over the next 2 to 3 years. But yeah, Symphony set the tone there. Reuters Messenger set the tone there, and I think you're going to see a lot of firms competing with each other to see who can take it to the next level. So.
But it is an interesting time because it's still pretty nascent. Compared to people that are not using bots, it's still a very, very tiny amount. So I think there's still a lot to come. Looking at chats as well, like historically, chats will be a human talking to a human, and now you've got humans talking to bots, like talking to a FinChat or talking to a GitHub Copilot, whatever it might be, or what chat that you might be using. So you got this kind of human to human, you got human to bot, and then you've got bot to bot. Now, the bot to bot, ipushpull has done some workflows where we've taken the high touch workflows where it was human to humans talking to each other, and then turned those into bot to bot workflows. Or in one use case, we've done fixed messages on one side and translated those to bot messages on another side. So this bot to bot kind of workflow is only going to increase. You have on the NASDAQ, I think 50% of the trades that go through on the NASDAQ is through algos, i.e. bots. So if you go on a website, I think similar traffic is like 30 or 50% of website traffic is bots. So no doubt you'll see the same thing in chat as well. Once you have agents then to start to appear, and you've got different protocols that are coming online, there's a bit of a VHS versus Betamax type moment in the world of protocols for agents to talk to each other. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. But in the not too distant future, there'll be the agent to agent workflows. And then it's about the controls around it, the identity of those agents, what they permission to do, what are they permission not to do. How do you see what we've learned with identity management for humans to humans at an enterprise level, applying that to agents in the future state?
I think it's going to be critically important. I mean, the idea, not a number of things critically important here. Identity and access for agents in an agent to agent, cross-firm communication world, human to agent, super important, because you've even had situations in financial messaging platforms where companies are hacking bot processes behind human identities, which hopefully will go away over time. That has always been kind of something that's talked about, that's never really like explicitly discussed, but as if you can automate keystrokes and you can automate local, macros and local applications, you can do things like that. And I think providing a level of verified identity for agents, verified identity for humans that are accessing agents and agents that are participating in things like group chats will be super important for the adoption of agents. The other thing that's going to be important, obviously, is just capture of messages, capture of outputs for anything that's done by an agent in financial services. I don't think enough is being spoken about that right now, in a sense that compliance capture, obviously critically important for human to human collaboration, but with an agent, it becomes the next level of importance, because there could obviously be, bad actors or things that happen that are blamed on the output of an agent without the compliance capture behind it. It's he said, she said. And I think the other last thing that's going to be interesting as we see agent to agent communication is just how that goes. I mean, we saw this, I think, demo a few months back where two voice agents were talking to each other and started talking in a completely different sound structure than normal human to human conversation. If you deploy two sort of chat agents in financial services to talk with each other, are they going to revert to some sort of a shorthand communication that, we'll have to decipher what happens there? And, that obviously means that, the identity management, the compliance capture, the how those interactions are going to go, they're going to be under heightened scrutiny, certainly for several years.
You mentioned kind of voice. So obviously you're doing kind of voice work in a different horizontal with Poly. But voice is obviously a big part of OTC trading in financial markets. And there's been lots of players that have appeared and disappeared over the course of 10 years or so. How important is voice going forward, and how good is the technology? Because everyone knows Alexa and Google and so on, and speaking normally about what's in my diary today, it's quite easy for a lot of these technologies to pick that up. Whereas when you get into the syntax and terminology and the way people speak in the markets, that's an entirely new language where there isn't necessarily any publicly available data sets for Google or Alexa to train itself on. So it's always not quite got to that 100% or 99% level. Not that humans are either, but the interpretation of some of that financial speak in voice is still proving challenging. How do you think that's going to change, and what could we learn in financial markets that you've done in other horizontal industries?
Yeah, I think, obviously it's been exciting to be part of the space in voice automation at PolyAI. Voice is super critical to like all industries, I think, consumer first. But one thing that is really interesting when it comes to financial markets is most of the evolution that we've seen of chat has been because voice interactions started to move to chat communication. And we saw this in platforms like we were talking about earlier in our discussion around dealing. So FX, big time. You've seen this in commodities where you've seen these sort of voice interactions over the last 30, 40 years start to move into like, bilateral communication over chat. And that could have been just because the technology around voice automation just didn't exist at the time that things like Bloomberg IB, Reuters Messenger were becoming really prevalent. but people still communicate in trading using voice. And there's been a number of companies that have tried to kind of make headway in that space, but it specifically in financial services, it's a tough space to monetize. And we've seen a lot of kind of struggle going on from the voice hardware providers, and I'm talking about the turret providers. We've seen a lot of struggle to monetize those products correctly over time. Symphony did a really interesting acquisition of Cloud9 a few years back, which became really highly used during the pandemic by traders. And they've done some really interesting stuff about integrating that. But having sat on the consumer side and watched how advanced the technology is now for customer service and voice, and how amazing we can provide experiences for the consumer space, I expect that trading automation is going to start leaning into voice technology, start looking for ways that you can really take those previous turret discussions, start providing agent automation. And you might see this start to become really prevalent. It's just about monetizing it and making it something that isn't just an offering tacked on top of a data provider offering, but something that could stand on its own 2 feet as a business that provides high value to the financial markets. And I think that's really the key here. And that's why we've seen other firms recently struggle to do that, even though, they had some interesting technology solutions for, voice trading.
And what do you feel around the value of the kind of captured data? Because there's lots of archiving and surveillance platforms that's capturing all of they call it e-coms, email and voice and chat and so on. But that's very much under the guise of, if the regulator knocks on the door in 3 years' time, you can call up the tapes and go through and so on. And you already mentioned on that kind of basis, that's looking at human interactions with markets and clients and so on, and communication. When you've got agents looking at it, that's a different kind of sphere and dimension that we need to think about around the controls. But capturing that data, there's the kind of the raw data that's in all of that chat, and then there's using techniques like NLP or whichever is the most appropriate technique to add structure to that data. Do you see kind of chat data as a strategic asset?
100%. Yeah. I don't think there's enough being done at this point with that level of data flow as far as making it have the level of value that it could have to organizations. It's a data set that is often the first touch points and interactions between two companies. I mean, we've seen this, for example, in the customer service space at PolyAI. We offer, voice assistance to our customers, and we, in many ways, become the first inbound data set for those customers when their customers interact with their voice agent. And when we look at financial services, when two individuals are interacting or someone is interacting with an agent, that is often the first touch point in like some thread of interaction that now is, like we've talked about in the rest of this conversation, a high value interaction. And looking at it from just an e-coms perspective is only half the battle. And you need to really start looking at this as it's almost like an asset. It's almost like the value of an asset class. It's like a data asset class in many ways when it comes to chat interactions for both insights, for market trends, for training more and more intelligent agents to dictate workflow. And I don't think you're really scratching the surface yet in the way that some of the solution providers could be thinking about it. Because the solution providers that provide archiving are focused on e-coms and surveillance in many ways. And I think the customer base is also focused on using those products for e-com surveillance. So two people need to change, and it's the customer and sort of the provider, but it's a huge opportunity to start providing more and more insight and value from that data. And I think we're going to see a huge amount of opportunity in the next 2 to 3 years and beyond in that particular aspect of chat.
To finish up, what do you see on the horizon in terms of enterprise chat? It feels like over the last 20 odd years, kind of chats come and go over time, particularly in the consumer world. The enterprise is probably a bit more sticky just because generally technology, is de facto a bit more sticky in the enterprise because it takes so long to roll technology out. People don't really want to rip it out and replace it with something new unless it's adding a lot of value. But what do you see as the trends besides some of the things that we've spoken about, like agents and automation, voice, and so on? Is there anything else that you think may significantly change kind of in the short term and then maybe in the longer term, like going out to like the end of the decade?
Yeah, I think, I mean, when we look at some of these consumer chat platforms, I mean, you've seen some development over the past, quarter two from WhatsApp as an example. You kind of got a kind of a level set by how people interact in things like Slack and Teams. Microsoft spent a good period of time trying to kind of see if their customers would use Teams for consumer interaction. So they had Teams for life. And then we've seen things in WhatsApp where they're now integrating agents, trying to figure out a way to make that work that's both embraces their model around encryption, and then starts to tease, can they provide solutions that people would use maybe for enterprise interaction, but also consumer interaction. So I think we're going to still start to see that play, where if we look at the past 2 to 3 decades of chat and fintech, we've seen platforms come and gone. I think one of the watershed things was certainly compliance, where things like AIM, Yahoo Messenger, these went away, and compliant data provider-based solutions became much more prevalent. But we're going to start to see in enterprise where companies want to see if they can capture all aspects of communication, whether they can capture your social communication, whether they can capture your enterprise communication. And that's really dictated by what Tencent did with WeChat. WeChat became every aspect of life for both business and consumer. And I think you're starting to see, like WhatsApp, Microsoft's thought about this, varying degrees of success there. And then you're just going to start to see, I think, a lot of the solutions around making agents kind of do those workflows that we saw WeChat do with mini programs and things that were like UI based programs, but now have companies being able to deploy agents into consumer platforms like a WhatsApp that really handle your day-to-day life. And once you're doing that, now you're bleeding that idea of, well, maybe this tool can do the same thing for enterprise that it can do for consumer. Can there be one platform that solves every problem? Can every human being talk on one platform about everything? There seems to always be a gravity to push for that. And I think we're going to continue to see that because large technology companies can gain more and more assurance of their market share by doing that. And then I think we'll see new players emerge in the space that are more AI focused, because I think even if you look at Microsoft Teams and Slack and you look at platforms like Bloomberg, maybe Symphony, LSEG, all these platforms are not AI first platforms. They're collaboration tools, directories for communication. That's their first focus, and they're now bringing AI in as an integration. I think you're going to start to see players emerge that would be AI first, and then how successful they'll be at providing what we talked about, which is high-value solutions that make someone pay for a solution provider that might be chat first. That seems to be the thing that we always don't know if it's ever going to succeed in this industry, if people will pay for a communication tool that can also be a workflow tool. Symphony's had a varying degree of success with that and probably been the most successful endeavor in that space. Can someone else do it with an AI first focus? Will be super interesting.
Oh, definitely. Watch this space, I guess.
It's the most, it's the most, Comtech is like the most exciting space now with the emergence of AI, emergence of LLM, chat and voice. And I think when you look at fintech and enterprise, it's just getting started, and it's going to be definitely change the way people work.
So Damian Sasso, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's been a great conversation. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
And if anyone wants to learn more about chat, do download the What is Your Chat Strategy report on ipushpull.com. We'll be releasing a next iteration of that around AI and agents in the next couple of months too. So Damian, thank you very much.
You're welcome.